So in this video I want to explain what is grounded theory and how to conduct a grounded theory study. And while doing so, I also want to debunk a number of common myths and misunderstandings about grounded theory. So the overall message, the underlying message of this video is also that contrary to what it may seem, contrary to a common assumption and what you may get from reading the literature, academic literature about grounded theory, in practice this methodology is not that complex, and essentially it consists of a number of relatively common techniques and steps, except that here in grounded theory they are all put together, which may look a little bit overwhelming, especially to beginning researchers and students. So first, the definition and the purpose of grounded theory. So grounded theory is a methodology, so a set of procedures, methodological procedures for conducting research that tends to explore relatively understudied phenomena or experiences and situations. And the main aim, as the name of the methodology suggests, is to develop a theory. But here an important point is that this so-called theory doesn't really have to be a big new theory. It can be just a detailed understanding. So theory can be in-depth understanding of a given phenomenon. So this leads us to the first myth that I wanted to debunk, namely that you have to develop a theory when conducting a grounded theory study. I know that it can put many students off this definition and this idea of having to develop a theory. It can be extremely overwhelming if you're a student, but don't worry, like I said, this doesn't have to be a proper theory, but rather a detailed understanding of what you're studying. So here you can also see that it's not much different from other types of research, because essentially you always want to develop a detailed understanding of whatever you're researching, except that in grounded theory, as I said, this usually also means that you're developing this detailed understanding of something that hasn't really been discussed that much, because this is an under-researched topic or phenomenon. And this kind of leads us to the second point. So the overall process of grounded theory, of a grounded theory study. This process is extremely inductive, which means that we want to establish our understanding or our theory strictly from the data. Hence the name grounded theory, because it means that this understanding is grounded in the data, comes from the data, not from, for example, previous research. So there are a couple of important implications of this assumption of grounded theory. So firstly, when analyzing the data, and I will come back to data analysis in this video, when analyzing the data, you don't want to start with a pre-existing concept or theory. So you don't want to, as your starting point, you don't want to adopt an existing theory or a set of concepts and then start looking for that theory or these concepts in your data. So kind of, to confirm whether your study also has these elements. This is definitely not what grounded theory is about. And secondly, you don't even want this to happen indirectly. So not only you definitely don't want to directly adopt a pre-existing framework and then follow it and apply it to your data analysis, but also you don't want this to happen accidentally. So you don't want your previous assumptions, your previous knowledge and your assumptions developed as a result of previous knowledge and previous reading. You don't want these to influence your data analysis and generally the whole research process. Which means that in practice that grounded theorists are very cautious about having this previous knowledge in the first place. So you can often hear that in grounded theory the scholars argue against reading too much, against having too much previous knowledge, and they say you should have this blank mind because this will enable you to be very objective and to avoid any kind of bias, and in fact to let the findings emerge from the data, as I said before. But this leads us to two more myths that I want to debunk here. So the first myth is that there isn't any previous research of the phenomenon you are studying. So This is not really true. Of course, as I said in the first point, in the first part of this video, ideally the topic you are studying should be under research, because if it's not, then there isn't really that much sense in developing this grounded theory if it has been extensively studied and there are plenty of models and explanations. So ideally it should be, you know, under researched, but this doesn't mean that there can be any understanding of the topic or any research, because imagine, is it even possible nowadays to find a single topic that has never been discussed before? In practice, what this means is that quite often you want to focus on a given aspect of a given topic, and perhaps the overall topic and the overall field is very extensive. There are plenty of different studies, but maybe there isn't much on this one particular aspect. So imagine if you want to conduct a study of gamers, you know, so people who play video games and stream online. Maybe you have this idea of conducting a study that aims to understand, you know, some motivations or experiences of, well, let's say, older gamers. There may be plenty of research into gamers in general, but maybe there isn't that much about older gamers. So this means already that you have found this, you know, relatively under-researched area or element of that general field that has been studied. So all I'm saying is that it is a myth that there absolutely cannot be any research and any understanding of your topic prior to your study. And another myth related to this topic is that you cannot have any knowledge and you cannot do any reading prior to your study. So in fact, in earlier versions of grounded theory, the authors were a little bit stricter about this, and in fact they did argue that you should avoid reading the literature. But later in the newer versions, these authors like Charmas were a little bit more reasonable, and they argued and they, you know, questioned this idea, and they said how can it even be possible not to have any previous knowledge, especially if you're a student or any kind of researcher. Usually it is the previous knowledge that pushes you and motivates you to investigate a given topic. You also need some previous knowledge in order to determine a gap and understand what you want to research. So in practice it's just not possible, especially if you're a student and you have to present some kind of a proposal and then first year progression report. So of course you cannot just not do any reading. Instead, what is recommended is that you're just cautious kind of about the reading. You do just as much reading as essential at this step, because later I will come back to it. You may want to go back to the literature when you have your findings, but generally you have to be cautious. And most importantly, instead of trying to act like there is no previous knowledge and there is no influence of your previous knowledge on the study, grounded theorists nowadays they argue that you just have to be very transparent about the influence of this knowledge. You have to be very conscious about this knowledge. You have to try to control this influence. So you have to be very reflective as well and think about what is it, you know, what in what I'm studying and what I'm analyzing, which, you know, elements can be the influence of what I expect to find there, of what I have read before. So you just have to be very conscious about your assumptions and your previous knowledge, rather than not do any reading at all. So this one is also a myth. Now, in terms of research methods in grounded theory study, I would say that the most common method is definitely an interview. If you look at published grounded theory studies, the vast majority of them have interviews, but this doesn't mean that it has to be the only method of data collection. You can have a couple of methods, you can mix methods, but it just makes sense that interviews are probably the most valuable source of information. If you think about it, if you think about trying to understand something that you don't really understand, there is not that much research into it, of course it just makes sense to conduct interviews, to ask people about this experience or phenomenon. Because even if you want to, you cannot really start with a questionnaire, for example, firstly because it's not just the perfect choice for a grounded theory study. It won't really generate plenty of data that you can analyze, and secondly, you can't even develop a questionnaire, because how can you know about the variables and the items to put there if the topic you're investigating has not been researched extensively. So interviews are definitely the most common method, and I'm not surprised to see that at all. So now on to data analysis in grounded theory. This one is quite characteristic to grounded theory, to the extent that some people like to refer to grounded theory as an approach to data analysis rather than a whole research methodology. I also know that it can be quite overwhelming and quite scary, because if you may have heard about line-by-line coding and categories and constant comparison methods. So if you're a student, or generally if you're new to grounded theory, you may find all of these quite overwhelming. But again, as I will explain, altogether, if you analyze all these separate elements of data analysis and grounded theory, you'll find that it's not that much different from your common thematic analysis and generally qualitative techniques for data analysis. Although the approach to data analysis will differ slightly depending on which approach to grounded theory you're following, or which school of grounded theory you are following, generally grounded theory starts, the coding and data analysis in grounded theory starts with line-by-line coding. If you want to know more about line-by-line coding, feel free to watch my other videos in which I explain what it involves, and I explain why it's very effective and very practical. And I actually believe it's a very good approach, especially for beginners, for those who are new to data analysis. So line-by-line coding is not as complex as it may seem. So basically it involves coding more or less each line of the text. But nowadays, again, the grounded theorists are not so strict about it, and they explain that you may code whole sentences, sometimes whole chunks or paragraphs. So this means that in practice you don't really have to code every single line of the text. So this is another myth. So line-by-line coding means that you have to code every single line. Sometimes it doesn't make sense to code every single line, and you'll see that as you start coding. So this is a myth. You don't have to code every single line. Nevertheless, line-by-line coding should be quite detailed. That's the whole point of it. So basically what happens, you start with this detailed approach, and then you have this extensive coding framework. You analyze, you look at this framework, you're developing more inclusive code, so you're joining some codes, then you're putting them into categories. So basically you're trying to organize your coding framework, and as you do that, these categories or these main themes, they become more and more inclusive, and eventually you start you're looking at your research questions, the aims of your research. So based on that, you're developing these higher order themes or categories again. So, and under these you put your existing themes or categories. I know this may sound a little bit complex, especially I guess in the way I put it, because I tried to summarize every single thing in just a few sentences. But it's not that complex. As I said, I have other videos, so just if you watch these videos, you'll see that everything will become very clear. But the whole point is that you are progressing from these initial very detailed codes into these more inclusive categories or themes that will be used when you report on your data. And also as you do that, so generally in the whole process of data analysis, what you're doing is you're constantly comparing different elements of your project, of your data. So you're comparing the content of the codes that you're creating, you're comparing the different participants' accounts, because you're trying to develop this understanding, you're developing these new themes. So generally you're constantly comparing things, and what you are doing professionally is referred to as constant comparison method. This is another thing that you may have heard of if you read about grounded theory, and it sounds like something extremely complex, something very specific to grounded theory, but it's not. So another myth to debunk: constant comparison method is not something extremely complex and something extremely typical to grounded theory, because in fact, again, in any kind of thematic analysis, you're doing these comparisons all the time. If you want your findings to be valid, if you want your claims to be valid, the claims you're based on your data, especially if you're working on some kind of a model or explanation or a theory, you have to go back to the data. You have to constantly validate and check your emergent, little theories and your suspicions about what's happening in the data. And another myth about the data analysis process is that the coding structure is something extremely unique and extremely complex. You may have heard names such as axial coding, open coding, initial coding, focus coding. Yes, they are quite unique to grounded theory, but there are a couple of points to remember. So firstly, as I said, the whole process, although it's grounded theorists use different names for these things, it does resemble the process of thematic analysis, because you generally want to study with, you want to start with some detailed codes, you want to start putting them, organizing them somehow in some kind of meaningful categories. This is what you do usually when you analyze the data. So here is just these different steps and these different names for the codes. Firstly, these names differ across different approaches to grounded theory. So for example, open coding is initial coding is in constructivist grounded theory. So this will already help you minimize the number of these new terms, because in fact, like I said, they are different across different approaches to grounded theory. And secondly, again, in the literature they may be presented as some clear steps. So you're starting with let's say open coding, then it becomes focused or axial or whatever. In practice, it doesn't really happen as such. So in practice, it's really quite a common sense process. Again, you want to put your codes into some categories, you're trying to understand them and you're trying to organize them, so it's quite common sense. And when you look back on it later on, you may realize, okay, so this was the stage when I did open coding and this looks like focus coding. So what I'm saying is that you shouldn't worry that much about these different classifications and names of the codes. And one more point about terminology. Again, if you think, I've been using these different words, codes, themes, categories. Themes are, as you know, they are generally used in qualitative research. Codes are just the units of analysis in your data analysis process. I also explain it in one of my videos. So what is a code, what is a theme? And categories, again, is just something quite unique to grounded theory. So this way they refer to these higher themes, so the final themes that are, the highest, the most inclusive themes. So again, it's just very important that, before you panic, before you get discouraged, just to understand that sometimes there are so many different words, but in fact you don't need all of them, because only some of them are relevant to this particular methodology. And finally, with regard to data analysis, you may have heard that in grounded theory studies, the researchers make use of memos, which are like notes or just something that some kind of notes that we record about the process of data analysis, about what we're finding. So quite often you can read that in the process of data analysis, also in that constant comparison process, you're also looking at the memos and creating new memos. So again, this is not something you have to do. That's one thing. So let's get on to another myth. You don't absolutely have to create these memos, but on the other hand, it's again quite common sense and quite natural that you do. You do want to keep an audit trail, so this is just a validation technique in qualitative research in general. So you do want to keep track of your decisions, what you're doing, how you're creating codes, what you're joining together in terms of code. So these are your memos, and also at the same time your memos may be about general interpretations and reflections. So this is important. Like I said, you don't have to do it, but most likely you will, because you usually want to reflect on what you're finding in the data, especially in grounded theory. You're reading these long interviews, you're developing these frameworks, these coding frameworks, and usually you have some suspicions and some thoughts, so you want to record them because later on you will probably want to investigate them and see if they are right. So this is part of you developing that explanation or that theory. Again, in terms of this process of making notes and then trying to validate these suspicions with your data, I talked about it in one of my previous videos when I talked about qualitative data analysis in general. Okay, so now let's talk about sampling and recruitment process in grounded theory. Let's start with straight away with the myth. So the myth is there is this weird sampling. It's called theoretical sampling. It's weird, it's complex, and you need plenty of participants for a grounded theory study. So none of these are true. On average, if you look at research that has compared average number of participants in grounded theory studies, on average it usually takes between 20 and 30. Unfortunately 2 is not realistic, but between 20 and 30 participants for a grounded theory study to reach saturation, which is the point when you feel that you have a more or less complete understanding of what you're studying. You don't need any more participants. So the average is between 20 and 30, but I've seen studies with 15 participants, and I think even with less in grounded theory. And now theoretical sampling. As I said, the myth is it's weird, it's something new, it's weird. It's not weird. So basically in grounded theory you start with a purposeful sampling. So you're recruiting the participants who you think may have some knowledge about your topic. Purposeful sampling. Nothing unusual and nothing unique to grounded theory. And then as you do your data analysis, as you analyze the data and you are developing this understanding or theory gradually, you may want to recruit more participants based on your emerging theory or your emerging understanding. So this is theoretical sampling. It's based on the theory. So let's say I'm conducting my study of gamers that I mentioned before, so people who play video games, and at one point my theory, my understanding, what is emerging from my data is that older gamers' motivations are different than younger gamers' motivation to play games. Unfortunately, I don't really have many older gamers in my data. Based on my data, I may have realized that the ones that I do have, the older gamers that I do have in my data, they have some specific beliefs or attitudes, but maybe I just have one older gamer and the rest of them are younger. But it's a big part of my theory, so I really want to understand whether this is in fact the case. So what I'm suspecting is the case. So what I'll do, I'll recruit more participants. This time I want to recruit these older participants because I want to compare their points of view to the ones that I already have. So predominantly the younger ones. So what I'm doing is theoretical sampling. It's purposeful sampling really all over again. So purposeful sampling, except that now it's based on what you think about the data, what you think may be the case, and now you're recruiting more because you want to double check whether you are right. So that's the whole process of theoretical sampling. In practice, another thing is that you don't always have to do it, so you may have a complete understanding based on your initial sample. So this is another myth, and you don't have to always recruit more and more and more participants. You may have an initial sample of 20 participants. It may be enough to reach saturation, it may be enough to explain the data, to develop a theory, so you don't always have to conduct this theoretical sampling. And the final point is about the overall aim and purpose and end product of your study. So as I said before, it's about developing a theory, but the myth is that you need this new complex theory. You need this ideally model and theoretical framework, and this is a myth because, as I said, the theory can be an explanation of the phenomenon, so it can be a detailed explanation. You don't necessarily have to create new models. These theories don't even have to be that complex to start with. So this is another myth. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. Remember that if you still require more assistance, if you're planning a study, if you want me to evaluate it or discuss your research proposal or talk about grounded theory, remember you can book a one-to-one tutoring session with me. I'll put the link in the description. So this is it. If you enjoyed this video, please like it to help it get found, and if you're new to this channel, consider subscribing.